I'd like to make a toast, Wyatt announced, raising his glass high as everyone at his housewarming party turned to look at him. His eyes gleamed with that familiar excitement, an expression I'd seen countless times when he was about to steal the spotlight. My stomach tightened instinctively. To new beginnings, new homes, and he paused dramatically, his voice catching with what seemed like practiced emotion, to Pop's memory. A respectful silence fell over the room. My grandfather had passed away just 4 days ago, and the wound was still raw and painful for all of us. I raised my glass along with everyone else, my throat constricting as I quietly honored the man who had shaped my entire life and career. The crystal champagne flute, one of Pop's prized possessions that Wyatt had somehow acquired, felt heavy in my hand. Speaking of Pop, Wyatt continued, setting his drink down on the sleek marble coffee table that dominated his sterile living room. I have an announcement to make. I watched, my heart pounding against my ribs, as he reached into the pocket of his perfectly tailored suit and pulled out an envelope, slightly worn at the edges. A cold sensation washed over me. There was something in the way he glanced at me, a flash of something calculated in his eyes, that made my skin crawl with unease. Before he died, Pop gave me this letter, Wyatt said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the vast living room of his new Manhattan condominium. I couldn't help but notice how the space lacked any real character, all chrome, glass, and status with no soul. He wanted me to have his vacation home by the lake, the architectural gem that we all loved as kids. The room erupted in surprised murmurs and enthusiastic congratulations. My parents beamed with obvious pride while Wyatt's fiancée Vanessa clapped excitedly, the massive diamond on her finger catching the light. My cousin Brielle shot me a confused look from across the room, her eyebrows furrowed with concern. She knew better than anyone how deeply connected Pop and I had been. I sat frozen, my brain refusing to process what I was hearing. The lakeside cabin wasn't just a vacation home, it was Pop's masterpiece, the place where he had first taught me about load-bearing walls and cantilever decks when I was just 8 years old. It was where I had spent nearly every weekend for the past 3 years, helping him replace weathered cedar shingles, restore the original windows, and simply soak in his wisdom about life and architecture. Wyatt, on the other hand, had visited maybe twice in the last 5 years, constantly complaining about the spotty cell service and how there was absolutely nothing stimulating to do. But more importantly, and my heart raced at the thought, Pop had given me a hand-carved wooden box 3 weeks ago, his arthritic fingers pressing it firmly into my hands as he made me promise not to open it until the time was right. Inside was a notarized deed transferring ownership of the vacation home to me, along with his original hand-drawn blueprints. He had already legally given me the property. It wasn't even part of his estate. As Wyatt unfolded the letter and began to read what were supposedly Pop's wishes, I studied his face intensely, searching for tells. My chest tightened with each word. Was my brother actually lying? Did he somehow know about the deed? Had Pop inexplicably changed his mind without telling me? That's great, good for you, Wyatt, I managed to say with a painfully forced smile, though my mind was spinning with disbelief and confusion. The walls of his massive living room seemed to close in around me. I needed to get back to my apartment and check the documents in that wooden box immediately. I quietly excused myself, muttering something about needing to use the bathroom, and escaped from the celebration. As I closed the bathroom door behind me, I leaned heavily against it and gulped in a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. The letter Wyatt had shown everyone didn't make any sense. Pop's handwriting had become increasingly shaky in his final months due to severe arthritis. I had watched him struggle to hold a pencil, but the signature I glimpsed looked suspiciously smooth and confident. My phone buzzed against my hip with a text from Brielle. You okay? That was weird. Wyatt never even cared about the cabin. He called it, that rotting time capsule, last Christmas. My fingers trembled as I texted Brielle back. Need to check something at my apartment. Can you cover for me? Say I got called to a site emergency? Within minutes, she had made my excuses to the family, and I slipped out the service exit while everyone was still fawning over Wyatt's supposed inheritance. the bitter taste of betrayal filling my mouth. The drive to my apartment felt surreal. City lights streaked past my windshield like shooting stars as memories of Pop flooded my mind with the force of a breaking dam. His weathered hands guiding mine as he taught me how to properly sand oak banisters. His deep voice explaining how light changes the character of a room as we watched the sunset paint the cabin walls golden. His hearty laugh when I miscalculated dimensions on my first blueprint attempts. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The vacation home wasn't just property, it was a living, breathing masterpiece where our most precious memories had been built beam by beam. My heart ached physically in my chest as I thought about it. This was the sacred place where Pop had taught me that architecture wasn't just about structures, but about creating spaces where life unfolds. Buildings have souls, Eliza. He would tell me, his blue eyes intense with passion. They breathe with the people who love them. Wyatt had never shown any interest in those lessons or in the cabin's architectural significance. He had mocked the exposed beams as rustic cliché and complained about the original hardwood floors being too creaky. His announcement felt like a hammer taking aim at something irreplaceable and precious. As soon as I reached my apartment, I fumbled with my keys, my fingers clumsy with urgency. I went straight to my workspace in the corner, a small replica of Pop's drafting area, and retrieved the wooden box he had given me. It was his old design box, worn smooth with decades of use, the cedar still releasing its comforting fragrance when opened. My fingers traced the hand-carved compass rose on the lid, a symbol of finding direction that Pop had etched himself. "Don't open this until you need to know the truth," he had told me 3 weeks ago, his eyes crinkling with that familiar wisdom that suggested he could see around corners that others couldn't even perceive. My hands trembled violently as I lifted the lid, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Inside lay several neatly folded documents, a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Pop's distinctive script, and a small brass key I recognized immediately. It opened the antique roll-top desk in Pop's study at the cabin, the desk where he had drafted his most celebrated designs, including the cabin itself. I unfolded the top document with shaking hands and gasped aloud, the sound sharp in my quiet apartment. It was exactly as I remembered. A notarized deed transferring ownership of the vacation home to me, dated 6 months ago. Beside it lay his original hand-drafted blueprints for the cabin, with notes in the margins about every thoughtful design choice. Alongside these was a letter in Pop's unmistakably shaky handwriting, the letters uneven from the arthritis that had plagued his final years. "My dearest Eliza," it began, and I could almost hear his voice in my ear. "By the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. I've decided to give you the cabin while I'm still alive to avoid any complications. You're the only one who truly understood this place as I designed it, not just a shelter, but as a vessel for our family story. Your brother never showed interest in its soul, only seeing it as a potential asset or an occasional party venue when I wasn't around." Hot tears spilled down my cheeks, blurring my vision as I continued reading, my fingers tracing his uneven script. "I know your brother might contest this, which is why I've had everything properly notarized and filed. There's a copy with my attorney, Harold Thompson. The cabin is legally yours already. This isn't part of my will or estate. I trust you to preserve not just its beams and boards, but the spirit and intention behind every corner and window. A building is only as meaningful as the care put into it by those who understand its purpose." I collapsed back into my chair, the letter clutched to my chest, utterly stunned. Wyatt had lied. He'd fabricated a letter, knowing full well Pop had already given the property to me. The cold calculation of it sent shivers down my spine. Even for Wyatt, this level of deception was breathtaking. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from my parents asking where I'd disappeared to. Wyatt had texted too, his message dripping with smug condescension. "Nice disappearing act, sis. Don't worry, you can still visit the lake house if you ask nicely. Thinking of modernizing it, maybe some steel and glass to replace all that dated wood." My blood went from ice to fire in an instant. That's when I knew exactly what I had to do. This wasn't something to handle via text or phone. No, This betrayal demanded something more direct, more honest. I gathered the documents with determined hands, carefully tucked them back into the cedar box, and checked the time. The party would still be going for at least a couple more hours. Plenty of Wall Street types drinking expensive scotch and praising my brother's exquisite taste. I wiped the tears from my face with the back of my hand, took a deep, steadying breath that filled my lungs completely, and headed back to my car with the box clutched tightly against my chest like armor. It was time for the truth to come out, for Pop's real intentions to be known. The drive back to Wyatt's Manhattan condo gave me time to collect my thoughts, my emotions swinging between rage and determination. I clutched the steering wheel tightly, feeling the rough texture against my palms. I wasn't going to cause a scene. That wasn't my style and certainly not what Pop would have wanted. I could almost hear his gentle voice in my ear. When you have truth on your side, Eliza, you don't need to shout it from the rooftops. The quiet truth hits harder than any loud lie. I parked a block away from Wyatt's building, the cedar box secure on the passenger seat beside me. For a moment, I just sat there, my heart pounding against my ribs as I gathered my courage. My mind flooded with vivid memories of all the weekends I'd spent with Pop at the cabin. Sanding weathered railings together, measuring for new window casings, his patient hands guiding mine as we restored the original stone fireplace, all while Wyatt was too busy with important meetings to visit. I remembered how Pop's face would light up when I arrived, those deep creases around his eyes crinkling with joy, how we'd spend hours on the porch swing he built himself, discussing the relationship between nature and architecture as the lake rippled before us. "What would you do, Pop?" I whispered, my fingers tracing the compass rose carved into the box's smooth surface, feeling each ridge and valley of the woodwork. The answer came almost immediately in my mind, as clear as if he were sitting beside me. The right thing, with grace. Buildings and bridges both need strong foundations. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill my lungs, and decided not to rush back into the party. Instead, I pulled out my phone and texted Brielle. "How many people are still there?" She replied within seconds. "Just family now. Most of Wyatt's Wall Street buddies left after dinner. The architect he was showing off to just left too. You coming back? Your mom keeps asking." This was perfect, exactly what I needed. I didn't want an audience of strangers for what I was about to do. I grabbed the cedar box, feeling its familiar weight against my chest, and walked the short distance to Wyatt's building, my footsteps echoing on the concrete. The doorman recognized me and let me up immediately. When I knocked on the door, it was Wyatt himself who answered, his expression shifting from obvious surprise to immediate weariness, his perfect smile faltering at the edges. "Site emergency resolved already?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. His eyes dropped to the box in my hands, and I saw a flash of recognition and fear cross his face. "We need to talk, Wyatt," I said calmly, stepping past him into the condo, the scent of expensive whiskey and aftershave hanging in the air. Everyone looked up as I entered the expansive living room. My father was examining what must have been Wyatt's letter more closely through his reading glasses, while my mother was already animatedly discussing renovation plans for the cabin with Vanessa, talking about modernizing that rustic old place. Brielle sat quietly in the corner, her trained counselor's eyes watching the scene with obvious discomfort. "Eliza's back," my mother announced unnecessarily, her voice slightly too loud. "We were just discussing Wyatt's wonderful news about Pop's lake house. He's thinking of adding floor-to-ceiling windows on the lakeside. Won't that be magnificent?" My stomach clenched at the thought of Pop's carefully designed proportions being destroyed. "Actually," I said, setting the cedar box down on the glass coffee table with a deliberate thud, "that's exactly what I wanted to talk about." Wyatt's eyes locked onto the box, unmistakable recognition flickering across his face. I could see the muscle in his jaw tighten as he clenched his teeth. "What's that?" he asked, his voice strained, though I could tell from his expression that he had a very good idea. "Something Pop gave me 3 weeks ago," I explained, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "He asked me not to open it until the time was right." I looked directly into Wyatt's eyes, holding his gaze. I think that time is now. Before Wyatt could protest, my father leaned forward with genuine interest, putting down his whiskey glass. What is it, Eliza? I opened the box carefully, the hinges creaking slightly, and removed the notarized deed, Pop's original blueprints for the cabin with his handwritten notes, and his letter written in that unmistakable shaky handwriting. 6 months ago, Pop legally transferred ownership of the vacation home to me. I said, my voice steady despite the thunder of my heartbeat in my ears. I carefully laid the documents on the glass table for everyone to see, the papers making a soft but decisive sound against the surface. It's already mine. It's not part of his estate or will. The room fell into a shocked silence. My mother's perfectly lipstick mouth dropped open while my father picked up the deed with a deeply furrowed brow, adjusting his reading glasses. Wyatt stood frozen by the bar cart, his face draining of color like someone had pulled a plug. I could see his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. This is properly notarized, my father confirmed, examining the document carefully, his architecture professor's attention to detail evident in the way his finger traced each line. And this is definitely your grandfather's signature. I'd recognize that distinctive K anywhere. He always made that little extra flourish even with his arthritis. That's impossible. Wyatt finally sputtered, his banker's composure cracking. A flush crept up his neck as he stepped forward. Pop gave me the letter. He specifically told me he wanted me to have the cabin. He knew I could properly maintain its value. May I see that letter again? I asked, extending my hand toward my father, feeling surprisingly calm as the truth began to emerge. He handed it over, and with deliberate care, I placed it side by side with Pop's handwritten letter from my box. The difference was stark and glaringly obvious. The handwriting on Wyatt's letter was a calculated attempt at imitation, but it lacked the telltale shakiness caused by Pop's severe arthritis. The signature was too perfect, too controlled. A forgery by someone who didn't understand that Pop's true signature had become increasingly difficult for him in his final months. Wyatt, my mother said slowly, her voice barely above a horrified whisper, did you forge this letter? Her hand trembled slightly as she touched her pearl necklace, a nervous habit she'd had for as long as I could remember. His silence hung in the air like a physical presence. The distant sound of Manhattan traffic filtered through the windows, emphasizing the terrible quiet in the room. Wyatt's silence stretched uncomfortably before he finally broke it, his voice a jarring mixture of defiance and desperation. You don't understand. None of you do. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. It's not fair that she gets everything. Everything? I echoed, genuinely confused by his outburst, my brow furrowing. What are you talking about? You were always Pop's favorite, Wyatt said, his words rushing out like water through a broken dam, his composure completely shattered now. Always visiting him, always helping him restore those stupid windows or whatever, always the perfect grandchild following in his precious footsteps. The rest of us barely got a look in. Do you know what that feels like? To be an afterthought in your own family? My father cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the raw emotion and the direction the conversation had taken. His eyes darted between us, unsure where to land. Wyatt, regardless of how you feel, forging your grandfather's signature is serious. It's not just unethical, it's potentially illegal. Let me see those. My mother interjected, reaching for both letters with trembling hands. She compared them side by side, her expression shifting from disbelief to profound disappointment as the truth became undeniable. Oh, Wyatt, she sighed heavily, her shoulders slumping. How could you do this? Your grandfather would be heartbroken. Vanessa slowly stood up, her face pale beneath her perfect makeup. The massive engagement ring caught the light as she fidgeted with her purse strap. I think I should go, she murmured, avoiding Wyatt's suddenly desperate gaze as she gathered her designer handbag and headed for the door with quick, purposeful steps. Wait, Vanessa. This isn't what it looks like. Wyatt called after her, panic evident in his voice. I can explain. But she was already gone, the heavy front door closing with a decisive click behind her. The room fell into another weighted silence. Brielle caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, but unmistakably supportive nod. She had always seen through Wyatt's carefully constructed facade, even when our parents seemed blinded by his charm and apparent success. "I don't understand," my father said finally, turning to Wyatt with genuine confusion in his eyes. "Why would you announce something like this without even checking if it was true? The will reading isn't until next week. What were you thinking?" Wyatt's face flushed deep red with anger and embarrassment. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time I could remember. "I found out about the deed," he admitted, his voice tight with emotion. "I was at Pop's lawyer's office last week asking about the estate assets, and Thompson mentioned that the cabin wasn't part of it because it had already been taken care of. He wouldn't tell me more because of client confidentiality, but I knew exactly what that meant." His eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. "I just thought." "Thought what?" My mother pressed, leaning forward with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Maybe Eliza would just let me have it if everyone already believed it was mine. Maybe for once everyone would take my side instead of hers." Wyatt snapped, his voice rising with each word, his Wall Street composure completely shattered. "Maybe I could finally have something that actually mattered to Pop too. Something that connected me to him the way she always was." His raw words hung in the air like smoke, revealing a jealousy far deeper and more painful than I had ever realized existed. My chest tightened with an unexpected twinge of sympathy despite everything. Had he really felt that excluded from Pop's life all these years? Had I somehow contributed to that without realizing it? "Wyatt," I said quietly, my anger giving way to a complex sadness. "Pop invited you to the cabin countless times. You always said you were too busy with work or that it was too isolated for your taste. Because I felt like a goddamn intruder every time I went there." He shot back, the vein in his forehead pulsing visibly. By the time I realized what I was missing, what I'd thrown away, it was already too late. You two had your special architect bond, your inside jokes about load-bearing walls, your traditions of watching the sunset from that specific spot on the porch. There was no room for me or my ideas. You both made that perfectly clear. My father shook his head slowly, profound disappointment etched in the lines of his face. "That doesn't justify lying to the entire family, son, or forging your grandfather's signature. He taught you better than that." Wyatt slumped heavily into a leather armchair, the fight visibly draining out of him like air from a punctured balloon. He loosened his tie with trembling fingers. "So what happens now?" he asked, not looking at any of us, his voice suddenly small. "You've made your point, Eliza. You win. You've always won with him. This isn't about winning," I said firmly, thinking of Pop and what he would want in this painful moment. The cabin had never been about power or status. It was about legacy and love. Despite Wyatt's terrible deception, he was still my brother, and Pop had loved him too, in his own way. I reached back into the cedar box and pulled out something I hadn't mentioned yet. A sealed cream-colored envelope with Wyatt's name on it, written in Pop's distinctive architectural block lettering. "He left something for you too," I said softly, holding it out across the space between us, a bridge of sorts. Wyatt looked up sharply, suspicion and fragile hope warring in his expression. "What is it?" "I honestly don't know," I admitted, meeting his gaze directly. "Pop made me promise not to open anything that wasn't addressed to me. It was his private message for you." After a moment's tense hesitation, Wyatt took the envelope and carefully opened it, his banker's fingers surprisingly clumsy. As he read the contents, I watched his expression transform, from defensive to shocked, and finally to something that looked remarkably like genuine remorse. His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the little brother I used to build blanket forts with. "He knew," Wyatt said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with emotion. "He knew I might try to claim the cabin. He saw right through me even then." My mother moved to sit beside him on the arm of the chair, her hand gently touching his shoulder. "What does it say, honey?" Wyatt hesitated, then handed her the letter, his hand visibly shaking. Read it, he said, swallowing hard. Everyone should hear it. I deserve this. My mother adjusted her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose and began. Dear Wyatt, if you're reading this, then Eliza has opened my cedar design box, which means one of two things. Either I'm gone, or something has happened that made her feel it was necessary to reveal its contents. I've known you since the day you were born, and I know your heart better than you might think. You've always craved recognition and validation, things I perhaps failed to give you in the way you needed. I see now how you might have felt overshadowed in our family of builders and makers. But I also know when you feel overlooked, you sometimes make impulsive decisions that hurt others and ultimately damage yourself most of all. The cabin has been transferred to Eliza. This was a decision I made with great thought and love, not because I didn't value you, but because Eliza connected with the place in a way you never did. She understood what makes architecture meaningful, that a building isn't just materials and market value, but the embodiment of ideas and memories. I trust her to preserve not just the structure, but the spirit of what I created there. What you need isn't a property to redevelop, Wyatt. It's a purpose that speaks to your unique talents. I've enclosed a check for $50,000. Use it to start something meaningful, something that combines your business acumen with something that truly matters. Find what makes your heart come alive the way architectural design does for Eliza. Perhaps it's that preservation foundation you mentioned when you thought I wasn't listening last Christmas. Or perhaps something else entirely that honors both beauty and practicality. I hope someday you'll understand that this isn't about favorites or fairness. It's about recognizing different paths for different hearts and minds. Eliza will keep the door open for you at the cabin, I have no doubt. She understands that buildings should bring people together, not drive them apart. But your future lies in building something of your own. Something that merges the practical world you inhabit with the artistic vision you've always had but rarely let yourself explore. With love and hope, Pop. When my mother finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The letter's words hung in the air, weighted with truth. Wyatt sat with his head bowed, the check clutched in his visibly trembling hand, his knuckles white against the paper. He saw right through me, he murmured, his voice cracking with emotion. Even from beyond the grave. He knew exactly what I'd do. My father moved to place a comforting hand on Wyatt's shoulder, squeezing gently. Your grandfather was a remarkably perceptive man. He understood people as well as he understood buildings. Wyatt looked up at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. His carefully constructed facade had completely crumbled, revealing the brother I remembered from our childhood. I'm sorry, Eliza, he said, the words seeming to physically pain him, but ringing with sincerity. I had absolutely no right to try and take what was already yours. What Pop entrusted to you because he knew you'd understand it. I nodded, not quite ready to offer full forgiveness but acknowledging his apology. The wound was still too fresh, but I could feel a path forward beginning to form. There's something else in the box, I said quietly, reaching for it again, feeling the cool, smooth cedar under my fingertips. I pulled out a small leather portfolio and opened it carefully to reveal architectural sketches spanning years. Childish drawings of Wyatt and me playing on the cabin's dock. Pop's detailed renderings of us building sandcastles by the lake. Beautiful watercolors of us roasting marshmallows with Pop at the fire pit he had designed himself. But most surprising were several pages of architectural sketches, clearly by a child's hand, with Pop's professional notations added alongside, suggesting improvements and praising creative elements. He kept this in his desk at the cabin. I explained, my voice soft with emotion as I turned pages to show sketches I'd never seen before. These are yours, Wyatt, from when you were 10. He saved every drawing you ever made. He never stopped hoping you'd rediscover this part of yourself. My brother stared at the sketches, a complex mixture of emotions washing over his face, recognition, regret, and something that looked like rediscovery. His finger traced one of Pop's notations. Excellent spatial awareness. Natural talent. I really messed up, didn't I? Wyatt whispered, his voice thick with regret. I forgot who I could have been. Yes, I agreed, not sugarcoating it, my eyes meeting his directly. But Pop obviously thought you could still become that person. He believed in the possibility of who you might still be. The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, contemplative rather than tense, sad rather than angry. The heavy weight of truth hung in the air, casting new shadows across the sleek surfaces of Wyatt's modern condo. The evening had taken a turn none of us had expected, laying bare years of complicated feelings and unspoken resentments that had been building like pressure against a dam. Brielle, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with her counselor's careful eye, finally spoke up. "So what happens now?" Her voice was soft but direct, cutting through the thick emotional fog that had settled over us all. It was the question hanging in the air, pressing against each of us with its weight. What do you do after a moment of painful truth? How do you move forward when foundations have been shaken by betrayal and revelation? I closed the cedar box carefully, feeling not just its physical weight but the tremendous responsibility Pop had placed on me, not just for preserving the architectural integrity of the cabin, but perhaps for rebuilding the damaged structure of our family too. "Now," I said quietly, my fingers lingering on the carved compass rose, "we try to honor what Pop wanted for both of us. We find our own paths forward, together if possible." The gathering dissolved soon after, like a building slowly emptying at day's end. My parents left with worried glances back at Wyatt, their expressions clearly torn between profound disappointment in his actions and genuine concern for his well-being. Brielle gave me a fierce, supportive hug before heading out, whispering with intensity, "Call me tomorrow. I'm here for you." And then it was just Wyatt and me in his expansive condo. The celebratory atmosphere completely evaporated, leaving a hollow emptiness that echoed with every footstep. Wyatt moved around his pristine kitchen mechanically, making espresso in a machine that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Neither of us really wanted the coffee, but it gave his hands something to do. The silence between us felt heavy with all the years of competition and misunderstanding, like a wall built brick by brick over decades. "I didn't plan it," he said finally, setting a delicate cup in front of me, the porcelain clinking against the marble countertop. "The forgery, I mean. When I found out about the deed from Thompson, I was so angry, so hurt. I felt cheated. I made the letter that same night after 3 scotches, not really thinking I'd actually use it." "Then why did you?" I asked, wrapping my hands around the warm cup, feeling its heat seep into my skin. My heart still ached with the betrayal, but I was beginning to see the wounded child beneath my brother's polished exterior. Wyatt stared into his espresso as if the dark liquid might hold the answers he'd been seeking his entire life. "When everyone was here tonight celebrating my new place, congratulating me on my engagement, on my promotion, I suddenly felt this crushing emptiness. I wanted more, something real, something that actually mattered. Something connected to Pop." He looked up, his expression vulnerable and raw in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. "I've always been jealous of what you had with him, that connection through building and creating. I chose numbers and deals instead. You could have had it too," I pointed out, not unkindly, my voice softening. "He wanted that connection with you. He kept every drawing you ever made." "I know that now," Wyatt admitted, running his hand through his disheveled hair. "But I was too proud, too stubborn, too caught up in proving myself in my own world to see it then." He hesitated, then asked the question that seemed to matter most to him. "What are you going to do with the cabin?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since Pop had given me the deed 6 months ago, a responsibility I felt in my bones. "Keep it as it is, fundamentally. It needs some careful restoration. The north-facing windows are starting to deteriorate, and the stone fireplace needs repointing, but I don't want to change its character or Pop's original design intentions. The proportions are perfect as they are." Wyatt nodded, looking genuinely relieved. "That's good. It should stay the way Pop designed it. The place has integrity." I studied my brother across the counter, this person I'd grown up with but sometimes felt I barely knew anymore. The expensive suit, the perfect haircut, the calculated success, but underneath, perhaps still the boy who had once drawn cabin additions with careful colored pencils. "You're welcome there, you know," I said quietly. "Anytime." The door is open. His eyes widen slightly in surprise, a flash of genuine emotion crossing his face. Even after what I did? The forgery? The cabin was meant to bring family together, not drive us apart, I said, echoing what I deeply believe Pop would have wanted. That doesn't mean I'm not still angry or that I trust you completely right now, but the foundation is still there. We can rebuild. Wyatt seemed to understand the qualified olive branch for what it was, a beginning, not a complete restoration. Thank you, he said simply, the words carrying more weight than his usual elaborate speeches. We sat in silence for a few more minutes, sipping coffee that had already grown cold. The night had been emotionally and physically exhausting, and there was still so much to process, so many cracks to fill. I should go, I said finally, standing up and feeling the fatigue settle deep in my bones. It's been a long night. Wyatt walked me to the door, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Before I left, he asked, his voice hesitant, do you think Pop knew this would happen? The showdown over the cabin? I thought about the careful preparation Pop had made. The notarized deed, the separate letters, his specific instructions about when to open the box, the childhood sketches he'd preserved. I think he hoped it wouldn't, I answered honestly. But he was prepared in case it did. He was an architect. He always planned for structural stress. Wyatt shook his head, a rueful smile softening his features for the first time that night. He always was 3 steps ahead of everyone else, wasn't he? Building foundations while we were still choosing wallpaper. That he was, I agreed, a genuine smile breaking through my exhaustion. That's exactly who he was. As I drove home, the cedar box secure on the seat beside me once more, I felt a curious mixture of emotions washing over me. A profound sadness for the painful revelations of the evening, an overwhelming relief that the truth had finally broken free, and a tentative, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be a turning point for Wyatt and me after years of drifting apart. The cabin keys felt unusually heavy in my pocket, not just metal, but the tangible weight of responsibility and cherished memories. My fingers kept reaching down to touch them, as if to confirm they were real. Pop had trusted me with something truly precious, his greatest architectural achievement, and I intended to honor that trust with everything I had. But perhaps there was room for Wyatt in that picture too, if he was willing to meet me halfway on the bridge we needed to rebuild. Tomorrow, I decided, my hands gripping the steering wheel with renewed purpose, I would drive up to the cabin at first light, sit on the handcrafted porch swing Pop had built with his own hands, watch the golden morning light dance across the water, and perhaps feel Pop's guiding presence one more time, helping us toward healing even in his physical absence. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it. The beautifully weathered cedar siding that Pop had insisted on for its natural resilience, the deep emerald green shutters that perfectly complemented the surrounding pines, and the white porch that wrapped around 3 sides of the structure, designed, as Pop always said, to catch every possible view worth seeing. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the early morning sun cast dramatic long shadows through the towering pines, creating intricate patterns across the ground that seemed to welcome me home like old friends. I sat in my car for a long moment, my heart pounding with emotion as I took it all in. This wasn't just mine now, not just a building or a piece of property, but a living sanctuary filled with memories and whispers of the past that resonated in my very bones. I could almost see Pop in his favorite hand-carved rocking chair, his worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes as he dozed in the dappled afternoon light, the blueprints for his next project always within reach. The cabin key slid into the lock with that familiar resistance I'd known since childhood. You had to jiggle it just right, a quirk Pop had stubbornly refused to fix because he claimed with a wink that it kept out the riff-raff and the architecturally uninitiated. Inside, everything remained exactly as he'd left it. Dog-eared architecture books stacked neatly on the side table, fishing gear organized with meticulous precision in the corner, the faint comforting scent of pipe tobacco lingering in the air despite his doctor's stern orders to quit smoking years ago. I moved through the room slowly, my fingers trailing along the smooth surfaces of furniture that had been in our family for generations, each piece telling its own story. The stillness felt peaceful rather than oppressive, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting with quiet patience to see what would happen next in its ongoing story. My phone buzzed insistently in my pocket, breaking the reverent silence. A text from Brielle. "How's the cabin? Your mom called me this morning. Wyatt is an absolute wreck. Hasn't shaved in days and canceled some big meeting." My fingers hesitated over the screen before I typed back. "Cabin's absolutely perfect. Exactly as Pop left it. Still not sure how to feel about Wyatt yet. My emotions are all over the place." Another message followed almost immediately. "He's been calling everyone trying to explain himself. He sounds genuinely torn up. Your parents are still pretty upset though, Dad especially." I wasn't surprised in the least. The fallout from last night's revelations would take time to settle, like dust after demolition. Trust, once broken, couldn't be mended overnight. Any architect knows you can't rush structural repairs. Setting my phone aside with a deep sigh, I walked to the large picture window Pop had specifically designed to perfectly frame the lake view. The water sparkled like scattered diamonds in the morning light, serene and unchanging despite the human drama unfolding around its shores. "I'm here, Pop," I whispered to the empty room, my voice catching slightly. "I'll take good care of your masterpiece. I promise you that with everything I am." 3 weeks passed before Wyatt reached out. His text was simple, lacking his usual corporate polish. "Can we talk? At the cabin, maybe? I have some ideas I'd like to show you." I deliberated for a full day, my finger hovering over the reply button countless times before responding with a time and date. Part of me wasn't ready to share this sacred space with him yet, but Pop's voice kept echoing persistently in my mind. "Holding grudges makes the heart heavy, Eliza. Sometimes forgiveness is more for you than for them. The best buildings have room for renovation." When Wyatt's car pulled up the following Saturday, I was sitting on the porch swing, nursing a steaming cup of coffee between my palms. He approached slowly, looking more subdued than I'd seen him in years, his designer clothes replaced by simple jeans and a flannel shirt, his hair unstyled, vulnerability evident in the slump of his shoulders. "This place hasn't changed at all," he said softly, glancing around with what looked like genuine appreciation in his eyes. "It's like stepping back in time." "That's exactly the idea," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me, the morning light casting interesting shadows across the porch floorboards. He sat down, fingers drumming nervously on his knees in a rhythm I recognized from our childhood. "I've been thinking about what to say for weeks," he admitted. "But everything I come up with sounds completely inadequate for what I did." "Try anyway," I suggested, my tone neither icy nor particularly warm, but open to possibility. Wyatt took a deep breath that seemed to fill his entire body. "I'm sorry, Eliza. Not just for the forgery, but for everything. For being jealous of your relationship with Pop, for resenting you when I should have been looking at my own choices and missed opportunities. For trying to steal something I didn't build or earn." I studied his face intently, trying to gauge the sincerity behind his words. The Wyatt I had known for years was a master of telling people exactly what they wanted to hear when it served his purposes. It was what made him successful on Wall Street. "Why did you do it?" I asked, leaning forward on the porch swing. "The truth, Wyatt, no corporate spin." He looked out at the lake, his gaze fixed on the distant shoreline for a long, thoughtful moment. The silence between us felt charged with unspoken emotions. "I thought if I had the cabin," he finally said, his voice unusually raw, "it would somehow magically make up for all the time I didn't spend here with Pop. Like I could just buy back those moments I missed with my big announcement." His voice cracked slightly, vulnerability showing through the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. "Pretty stupid, right? The investment banker thinking he could purchase lost time." There was something in his admission that felt genuinely painful and authentic, not an excuse calculated for sympathy, but a sad acknowledgement of a deeply flawed thought process. I felt my heart softening despite my lingering anger. "I used the money," he said suddenly, turning to face me directly. "Pop's check? For what?" My curiosity was genuine, my fingers tightening around my coffee mug. I enrolled in that architectural preservation workshop Pop was always telling me to join. The one I was far too busy with important meetings to attend. He gave a self-deprecating laugh that held no humor, just regret. Turns out I have a decent eye for historical details, but terrible drafting skills. But I'm going to stick with it anyway. He was right all along. There's something incredibly centering about focusing on creating and preserving something with your hands rather than just moving money around. It was a small thing but remarkably significant, coming from Wyatt, who had always been too impatient and status-conscious for such hands-on pursuits. The image of my Wall Street brother hunched over a drafting table made my heart ache with unexpected tenderness. Pop would have absolutely loved that, I said quietly, meaning every word. We sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the gentle rhythmic lapping of water against the shore and the distant melodic call of birds. It was the same peaceful natural soundtrack that had accompanied countless meaningful conversations between Pop and me over the years. The familiar sounds wrapped around us like a comforting blanket. I have something to show you, I said finally, rising from the swing with a sense of purpose. Wyatt followed me inside to Pop's study, where the magnificent antique roll-top desk, a piece he had salvaged and restored himself from an old architectural firm that was being demolished, stood in the corner, bathed in golden morning light that streamed through the precisely positioned windows. I used the small brass key from the cedar box to unlock it, revealing meticulously organized compartments filled with papers, letters, sketches, and small meaningful mementos collected over a lifetime. Pop kept everything, I explained, carefully pulling out a folder marked Wyatt in Pop's distinctive architectural lettering. Inside were newspaper clippings of Wyatt's high school debate championship victory, photos of his MBA graduation ceremony, and even a carefully preserved printout of the Wall Street Journal page announcing his promotion last year, with Pop's notes in the margin. My grandson, making his mark. He was incredibly proud of you, I said softly, watching my brother's expression transform. He just showed it differently than the validation you were looking for. He saw your achievements, Wyatt, even when you thought he didn't. Wyatt's fingers trembled visibly as he carefully paged through the collection of his life's milestones, preserved with obvious care. I had no idea he kept track of all this, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I always thought he was disappointed I didn't follow in the family's architectural footsteps. There's a folder for each family member, I explained, my hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He called it his legacy collection. You were very much a part of that legacy. Wyatt looked up at me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I really messed everything up, didn't I? Yes, I agreed, not sugarcoating the truth but softening my tone. But Pop believed in redesigning from strong foundations. So do I. I pulled out a blueprint from my portfolio case and carefully unrolled it on the desk. These are my plans for restoring the cabin's west-facing deck and boathouse. I've marked weekends when I'll be working on these projects. I could use an extra pair of hands. Even terribly inexperienced preservation workshop ones. A genuine smile tugged at his lips for the first time that day, reaching his eyes. Really? You'd want my help? The cabin was designed to bring family together, not drive us apart, I said, echoing what I deeply believed Pop had always intended. That was built into the very blueprint of this place. Later that afternoon, we sat side by side on the end of the dock, our feet dangling in the cool, crystal-clear water. Wyatt surprised me by pitching thoughtful ideas for renovating the boathouse that actually respected its original character, while I sketched possibilities in my drafting notebook. You know, Wyatt said reflectively, looking out across the shimmering water. I think Pop knew exactly what he was doing, giving you this place. What do you mean? I asked, pencil pausing mid-stroke. You didn't just inherit a cabin, he said thoughtfully, with newfound wisdom in his voice. You inherited his most important role, keeping the family connected to what truly matters, to something more lasting than success or money. You're the new cornerstone. As the sun began its magnificent descent behind the mountains, casting brilliant golden reflections across the lake's surface, I realized with profound clarity that Pop had given me far more than just property. He'd given me the chance to heal old wounds and forge new connections, beginning with the brother I'd almost lost completely to resentment, competition, and pride. In his final design, we weren't just preserving a cabin, we were rebuilding a family.